Hi everybody, Ryan Ballengee here with Golf News Net, and thanks for checking out the channel once again. So, at the Open a couple of weeks ago over in Northern Ireland at Royal Portrush, after a couple of rounds, Xander Schauffele came out in the media and explained that his driver, a Callaway Golf driver, failed the R&A's random testing for what's called characteristic time. And this is something the R&A has been doing for each of the last couple of years. In the Open, they've taken 30 drivers at random from the 156 player field and tested what's called the characteristic time as a measurement of how much energy is transferred from the driver to the ball at impact, and to see if any of the drivers in play in the players' bags, the ones they're actually using, are past the legal limit. And unfortunately for Xander and a couple of other players, their drivers were deemed illegal because the R&A's testing indicated that they were past what's called the characteristic time limit. And then Xander kind of went into a little bit of a rant. He talked about why he wished there were more players that were tested rather than just a sampling of 30, which is effectively 20% of the field, why they would like to see more testing week to week, and a bunch of other issues. And then ultimately all kind of got resolved. But no one really did a good job of explaining what characteristic time is, what it has to do with driver legality, and what it might have to do with you personally. So the USGA and the R&A have the same equipment standards. They adopted those basically in the early 2000s, finally unifying things a little bit. There used to be two different standards. The R&A had one and the USGA had one, and they each kind of differed in pretty substantial ways. So manufacturers tried to appease both by manufacturing to both standards. So now that they're the same, they don't have to worry about that. But among the many equipment standards that there are that include the size of your driver in terms of displacement and in terms of the actual physical space that it takes up, there's also something that regulates the amount of energy that can be transferred from the club head to the ball at impact. And the original measurement for that is called the coefficient of restitution. And the coefficient of restitution basically says how much energy goes from the club head through the face to the ball at impact, and as a percentage of the energy transferred. And the limit used to be a cap at 83% or 0.83 as the coefficient. So that meant from the driver head, all the energy that you create from your swing speed and from the design of the club and the aerodynamics and all of that, 83% of that energy could be transferred to the ball that would then go out onto the golf course as soon as you hit it, right? But the USGA and the R&A had a really hard time testing that in the field with golfers because to test coefficient of restitution, they literally took a driver head, like this one, they mounted it, and then they shot a golf ball at it. And once the golf ball hit it, it measured how much energy transferred back to the ball after being shot at the club head. And if it was greater than 83%, the driver was deemed non-conforming. And actually, it's really 82%, but 82%, but they give an extra little bit measurement leeway because this is very expensive equipment. We're talking really fine points here. And so they wanted to kind of give a little leeway. So you could go up to 83% measurement and not be considered non-conforming or illegal. But the R&A and the USGA wanted to come up with a test they could do anywhere with less machinery, just as finely calibrated, but less size in machinery. So they came up with the characteristic time test. And characteristic time is a little bit different than COR. Characteristic time is the measurement of how much time the ball spends on the club face when at impact. And that is an indicator of how much energy is transferred, because the more time that a ball spends on the club face, hypothetically, when center struck, the more energy that could be transferred. So they came up with a test to determine the maximum amount of time that a ball could be, or a ball or the measurement that their device that they're using could be on the club face. And then that would be the indicator, really, of coefficient of restitution. But characteristic time is what it's labeled. And that measurement, the maximum, is 239 microseconds, which is 239 millionths of a second. Now, we're talking, obviously, a really short period of time. So the USGA and the R&A decided, well, they would allow for additional time in these measurements so that if there was a calibration issue or there was a measurement issue or some other problem, a driver could still be deemed conforming. So they added 18 microseconds. 18 microseconds. Plus or minus that a driver could still be considered conforming. Now, of course, if you're in that window minus 18 seconds, it doesn't matter, you're going to be legal. But if you're over that 18 microseconds, then if you go to 258 microseconds or more, it's considered an illegal or non-conforming driver, and it cannot be used. And so in this case, and in all the cases of the illegal drivers that were found among those that they sampled at Royal Port Rush, the driver that Xander Schauffele was using, the Callaway driver, measured at 258 microseconds, which is 1 microsecond over the allotted measurement tolerance from the USGA and the R&A. That was deemed non-conforming, and that meant Xander Schauffele had to get a new driver before playing on Thursday, or otherwise he would be using a non-conforming club, and that would ultimately lead to penalty strokes or disqualification. So Schauffele had to run around, find another driver, test it out, figure it out, and all the while, plenty of other players in the field who may have had a non-conforming driver didn't have to make changes. Now, fortunately for Xander, had a very good week, not the best week, but a very good week, and made a comeback after a very difficult Thursday round. But now there's all this talk about characteristic time and week-to-week testing on the PGA Tour and how do we test drivers on a regular basis. And the reality is the PGA Tour is in no situation and has no interest in conducting regular and routine equipment testing on their players. Not only because they would have to test drivers, but because they would have to test pretty much every club in the bag. There are regulations around the coefficient of restitution / CT for every club in the bag, not just the driver. It's every club. It's just that the driver gets closest to that limit because the ability to thin out faces and use new materials and build really interesting shapes that convert so much of your potential energy into actual energy when you hit. This is really the only club that threatens to hit that 257 mark or higher in terms of microseconds and characteristic time. But there are also regulations around grooves, there are regulations around total mass properties, there are all kinds of different regulations around almost every club in the bag. And so for the PGA Tour, they would have to have plenty of employees, they would have to have testing before every single round because you could change out clubs, and you would have to spend a lot of time measuring players' clubs for legality, and they don't want to do that. Neither does the USGA for that matter, and they have said as much to multiple media outlets, and over the years they've said to me personally, they are not interested in going to PGA Tour events every week and testing everybody's equipment. That's not what they want to do. So what they want to try to do is work with manufacturers, and they do this on a regular basis. They work with them all the time because manufacturers send them new clubs for testing, make sure they're conforming so that they can sell them. The USGA and R&A give them feedback, and it helps in the design process, kind of keeps it in the box, so to speak. And so the USGA and the R&A, they want to make sure that manufacturers are trying to kind of gear their characteristic time toward that 239 number. They don't want them gearing toward the 255, 256, 257 limit, because what if it goes over? And then there's something else that has been brought up by players, by Callaway Golf CEO Chip Brewer, and by others over the years, that the more you hit a driver, the hotter the face gets because you kind of break it in, so to speak. And so the face flexes a little bit more over time. And it can take as little as 30 really solid hits from an all-world player to stretch this thing out so that it is suddenly non-conforming. And if you find a driver that's hot, then you stick with it. And if it's a little bit hotter, it's great. You're going to stick with it until someone tells you you can't. And so in the drivers in question, Callaway talked about trying to manufacture really closer to the limit, to the 257 limit than the 239 number, because these players go through drivers frequently. They want to get absolute advantage that they can, and they want to be able to get the best out of their equipment. And so when we're talking about characteristic time, when we're talking about 1 microsecond, we're not really talking much of an advantage. But 5 microseconds leads to 1/4 of a mile per hour in additional ball speed. So that's maybe a couple of yards in 1 mile per hour of ball speed. So we're not even talking but 1/4 of a yard kind of deal. And if you get to that limit, that measurement tolerance between 239 and 257, well, now we're talking closer to 1 mile per hour. Now we're talking 2, 3, 4 yards, depending on how you hit it, your shot characteristics, launch characteristics, all of that stuff. So really we're talking about a couple of yards here. But for the people out on the PGA Tour and the LPGA Tour, the European Tour, all the major tours around the world, that can mean a difference on every shot. And so these guys want to use the equipment that's up to the maximum limit. So moving forward, manufacturers are going to have to do a little bit more testing on site, particularly at the Open Championship, to make sure that the drivers their players are using are conforming. And they can do that by using a machine that the USGA and the R&A created. It's $7,000. You can find it online. You can Google it if you would like to have one. And what the USGA and the R&A do is they kind of mount the driver up, and then they have a pendulum that swings down. And the pendulum kind of has a metal ball on it, so to speak, a metal piece that hits the face in 3 different places. Front, in the center, in the right, and the left. And they test the characteristic time. They test the amount of time it takes for the vibration basically to stop, and that kind of gives you an idea of what the characteristic time is. And it has to be conforming across the face. It doesn't have to just be conforming in the middle. It's got to be conforming everywhere on the face. And they do it 3 times on each just to make sure that the measurement's right. But again, we are talking in millionths of a second for that particular measurement. And we would be talking in millionths of a second when an actual golf ball hits it. A little bit, about double the time. And so it's really difficult to guarantee that from device to device the measurement will be the same. And that's Callaway's gripe. They said that they measured Xander's driver and it was at 255 microseconds, which would be within the measurement tolerance and would be considered conforming. The R&A disagreed. Their equipment said it was at 258 microseconds. So the difference of 3 microseconds is the difference between conforming and you can play it, and non-conforming and you can't play it. And the R&A wasn't going to back off of that using their equipment. So what's the solution? As mentioned before, probably the solution is to try and scale back, making how some hot some of these drivers can be, and try to get them in the low 250s if you're going to try to manufacture to that kind of level of hotness. Give yourself a little bit of wiggle room in the measurement. But for the average consumer, you're trying to buy a driver that's as hot as possible too. And TaylorMade is among the companies marketing their drivers as the hottest on the market, including the M5 and M6 drivers, which they say the faces are manufactured beyond the USGA and the R&A limit, and they use special resin pumped back behind the face in the head to scale it back to the legal limit. So that's not going to change. That's a potential edge in all these manufacturers that they can offer you as the golfer and a professional golfer who's wearing their logo from week to week, who gets paid a lot of money and wants to earn their livelihood based on the trust that they have in that company and their equipment. They're manufacturing it to the absolute limits of the rules, but not illegally so. So I think this debate's going to rage on a little bit more. We'll still have more conversation about whether there should be equipment testing week to week on the PGA Tour. There's a fat chance that ever happens, and for very good reasons because of the complexity and the logistics of all of it. But know that in this case, while these drivers were considered non-conforming, they essentially had zero performance benefit over a regular driver, including the one their peers were playing and the ones that you probably play in your bag at home. So if you have questions, please let me know. Find me on Twitter. I'm at Ryan Ballengee. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.